These stories take more time to find, but if you'd like your story featured, send it to r/Malliem and use postflare to tag it as a true scary story. Satanic rituals next to my summer vacation home. This story takes place in the Algarve, a highly popular tourist region in southern Portugal, in a fairly isolated family house where my cousin, my mom, my aunt, my grandparents, and I vacationed every summer. It was a beautiful, fairly large house designed by my grandfather himself, and the property included a medium-sized fenced terrain where my cousin and I often played during our childhood. The events I'm about to recount took place around 2012, when I was 12 and my cousin was 9. Despite the many happy childhood memories I have of the house, it always gave me an unsettling vibe that left me feeling a bit on edge. Every year when we visited, I would experience a recurring nightmare, sometimes multiple times per stay. The dream always took place in the house and revolved around my cousin and me trying to escape to call for help after realizing several masked men dressed in all black had intruded onto the property. Despite frequently waking up in a cold sweat, I didn't give the dream much importance. I was a fairly rational kid and had multiple different recurring dreams before, although not as frequent, so I didn't find it particularly strange. That summer of 2012, the familiar nightmare returned as expected, but this time it left me feeling especially anxious and paranoid. I felt compelled to check around the perimeter of the fence, precisely where I'd seen the intruders in my dream. As the responsible older cousin, I made sure to ask for permission to roam outside the fenced area. I can't recall whether I made up an excuse or was upfront about wanting to check if the fence was broken, but my family dismissed it as typical kids being curious. They allowed us to explore, as long as we didn't go far, since the nearest house was more than a 15-minute walk away. Before heading out, I went inside to grab a bottle of water, given the unbearable 40 degrees Celsius heat, and a small Swiss Army knife, just in case. Then my cousin and I set off to inspect the perimeter. We started from the right of the entry gate, and by then, my anxiety had been replaced by an adventurous spirit and the false sense of security any 12-year-old would feel from carrying a knife, no matter how small. To the right of the property stood a small, completely collapsed ruin of a house from the 1970s or so. It caught our attention since we had always been curious about it, but after a brief glance, we lost interest. The roof had caved in and there wasn't much to see, so we moved along. The rest of the walk was uneventful. We played with sugar canes we found near a small creek, goofing around and enjoying ourselves. Eventually, we decided to head back inside to play video games, until I saw something strange. About 20 to 30 meters from the property, near the left side of the gate, something white on a stick glistened in the sunlight. Intrigued, I walked over to take a closer look. The moment I realized what I was looking at, I was frozen and panicked. My younger cousin wasn't as alarmed, likely due to being a bit younger, but I instantly knew something was deeply wrong. It was a half-decomposed goat head impaled on a stick. In hindsight, it wasn't fresh. It must have been drying in the sun for ages, as what remained was mostly just the skull and patches of dried skin. I told my cousin we needed to go back, and we bolted straight to the house to warn our family. They went to check it out, but refused to talk about it afterward. At the time, I had no knowledge of satanic rituals, so I didn't fully grasp what I had seen. It wasn't until years later that my mom explained that the skull was indeed there, but more than that, there were traces of candle wax in several spots, forming a circle around it, indicating that a ritual sacrifice had likely taken place. When I asked if anything else strange had happened there, she admitted that while they never found anything as disturbing as the goat head, they had repeatedly noticed areas where the tall, dried grass near the property had been flattened in perfect circles, as if a dozen or so people had sat down together. We eventually had to sell the house due to financial issues, but to be completely honest, I don't entirely regret it. The unsettling feeling I had there never truly went away, and neither did the nightmares. it was always just beneath the surface, lurking. Keep in mind, all this stuff took place really close to the property, and given the very low density of houses in that area, they could have done it in a million other places and we would have never known it, making it really seem like they were particularly targeting our property. This is made even sketchier by the fact that, where they had done those things, it would have been very easy to spot a person from the house, making me think they most likely scouted out the property to check if someone's home. From that day forward, every time I stepped outside to go to the pool or walk around the terrain, I felt exposed. The house itself felt somewhat safe as, given the isolation, it had to have strong metal blinders placed around every window, which we secured every night. I still get goosebumps thinking about that place, and looking back, those nightmares weren't very normal given how often and for how long they reoccurred. Personally, I think it was my subconscious giving me a warning that something was up. Maybe I'd seen something else around the property when I was younger, and my brain just processed the information that way. I honestly don't know. But the dream stopped after selling the house, and I hadn't thought about it in years. Now, I just pity the guys that bought the property and hope they don't experience what we did. He was in my room 3 years later. Growing up in a small town means that everyone knows everybody and everything about them. When I was in elementary school, there was this kid. Let's call him E. I don't want to use his real name. He lived about a quarter mile from my house. His family was extremely poor, living in a very dilapidated trailer. On top of having very little money, they had another son, older than E, who was severely mentally handicapped. He could not walk, could not learn to speak, use the bathroom, or eat on his own. E's father worked in a factory, while his mom stayed home to care for their brother. Even though they had financial struggles, they tried to give their children a safe space to grow up. Even though we lived in the backwoods middle-of-nowhere town, kids would make fun of E for coming from a poor household. He wasn't always the best smelling, greasy hair, and his clothes were old hand-me-downs. If you know children, you know they can be cruel. They hurled insults and disgust towards him for things out of his control. I never joined in on the teasing. I was friends with those who teased him, but never joined. I would sit next to him on the bus ride to school, even though we were not friends. We did have one thing in common: Transformers. For his birthday and Christmas, he would always get a Transformer or two. I remember in 4th grade, when the live-action Transformers movie came out on DVD, I gave him it as a birthday present on our way to school. Even though we were friendly with each other, the hazing and bullying he faced, along with the hardships of growing up in a low-income household where most of the attention goes to a handicapped brother, took its toll on his mental health. I saw him every day at school, from kindergarten to 6th grade. Watched this kid that acted like any other kid, slowly morph into a hermit that never talked and would have outbursts at least once a week. I struggled with school throughout elementary school. My parents decided to pull me out of public school and homeschool me until I was caught up with other kids my age. I was angry about it at the time, but in the end, I was happy they did. We would see E walk down the entire length of the road, which was about 4 miles every day. A scrawny teen talking to himself every day walking down this road after the junior high got out of school. A year later, in 8th grade, I noticed I didn't see him anymore. I texted one of my friends who went to school with E if he knew how he was. My friend said that E had asked a girl out at school and had been rejected and ridiculed in front of everyone in the hallway. He was so angry and mentally unwell that the next day, he brought his father's handgun to school. He waited until she went into the girl's locker room. When she entered, he went in after her and pulled the gun out. He raised it up and pulled the trigger. The gun clicked. Luckily, there were no bullets in the gun. A staff member saw him go in after the girl and went to go pull him out. They saw the firearm and tackled him to the ground. He was arrested and served 3 years in juvenile detention for his crime. When he got out later in high school, he was even further gone. He never went back to school. Now, every day, all day, he would walk this road, talking to himself, yelling at the cows in the fields and cars driving by. I heard he tried for the military but was turned away. He wore a military getup with a bomber leather jacket and a beret every day, no matter rain or shine. I was riding my bike to my friend's house when I passed by him. I stopped and said hi. I hadn't spoken to him since the last day of 6th grade. He yelled at me that he would kill me and my family for bullying him. I just rode to my friend's house and took another way back home at the end of the day. When it was time, I left for college, never thinking about E or his threat again. I came home for summer break after my freshman year of college. I saw him walking down the road. Our eyes met as I drove past him, and he screamed, "Kill!" at me. I knew that he knew what road I lived down, but not the house. I parked in the garage because I saw him running after me as I turned down the road. I'd lost him in his chase. Hard to keep up with a car when you're on foot. I went about my day at home with my parents, and everything was normal. Later that night, I was getting settled down for bed. I opened my window in my room on the 2nd story to let in cool summer night air into my stuffy room. I awoke sometime around 2 a.m. to a creak outside my door. Thinking it's probably one of my family members walking in the hall to the bathroom or going downstairs, I went back to sleep. It must have been 20 or 30 minutes later. I heard another creak. I recognized this creak, one I heard every morning when I stood in front of my closet. I shot up to see a lanky figure lit up by the pale light of the moon shining in through my open window. I quickly got out of bed. It was E. He was standing there. I ran out quickly. I didn't want to fight. I didn't know what he had on him. A gun? A knife? I would rather not find out fighting in the dark. I yelled, waking up my family as I ran out of the hall and slamming the door behind me. My family came out and I yelled, "Run!" It was at this moment that E ran, bolted out the door as well. He sprinted down the stairs and out the door. My dad called the cops and they came to take our statement. He told them who it was and where he lived. They went to his home to question him. He wasn't home though, and they never found him. It's been 7 years since that night. I have since moved further away from that house, and so have my parents. I always kept my eye out for E every time I visited home, till I permanently moved away. I never did see him again, and the police never followed up. I feel like I never bullied him or hazed him. I tried being friendly with him when we were growing up. Some people just don't have good mental health. Bullying can further the decline, which in this case I got the consequences of his childhood. I hope he is getting the help he needs in a home and professionally. I hiked through a Scottish ghost town at night. For the past 2.5 years now, I have been living in the north of the Scottish Highlands, and when I say north, I mean as far north as you can possibly go. I live in a small coastal town, which is actually the northernmost town on the British mainland. I had always wanted to live in the Scottish Highlands, which seemed like a far cry from my gloomy hometown back in England, and when my dad and his partner told me they bought an old house up there, I jumped at the opportunity. From what they told me, this place sounded like the perfect destination. There were seals and otters in the town's river, dolphins and orcas in the sea, and at certain times of the year, you could see the northern lights in the night sky. But despite my initial excitement of finally getting to live in the Scottish Highlands, full of beautiful mountains, amazing wildlife, and vibrant culture, I would soon learn that the region I had just moved to was far from the idyllic destination I had dreamed of. In my spare time, I took to exploring the coastline around the town's area. On one of these days, I started to explore what was east of the town. On the right-hand side of the mouth of the river, there's an old ruin of a castle, but past that leads to a cliff trail around the eastern coastline. 6 or so months later, and into the Christmas season, I'd just gotten out of a long-distance relationship. Feeling as though I'd finally found closure, I decided I wanted to go on a long hike by myself along the cliff trail. And so, the day after Christmas, Boxing Day, I got my backpack together, packed a lunch for myself, and headed out at 6 a.m. The hike along the trail had taken me all day, and by the evening, I had walked so far that I actually discovered what I first thought was a ghost town. What I found was an abandoned port settlement, which had the creepiest looking disperse of old stone houses, as well as what looked like the ruins of an ancient round tower. As it turned out, this was actually a heritage center, a tourist spot. It seemed I'd walked so far around the rugged terrain that I was now 10 miles outside of my town. On the other side of the settlement were very high, distant cliffs, which, compared to the cliffs I had already trekked along, were far grander. Although I could feel my legs finally begin to give way, and already anticipating a long journey back along the trail, I decided I was going to cross the bay and reach the cliffs, and then make my way back home. By the time I was making my way around the bay, it had become very dark. I'd already walked past more than half of the bay, but the cliffs didn't feel any closer. It was at this point when I decided I really needed to turn around, as at night, walking back along the cliff trail was going to be dangerous, and for the parts of the trail that led down to the base of the cliffs, I really couldn't afford for the tide to cut off my route. I made my way back through the abandoned settlement of the Heritage Center, and at night, this place definitely felt more like a ghost town. Shining my phone flashlight in the windows of the old stone houses, I was expecting to see a face or something peer out at me. What surprisingly made these houses scarier at night were a handful of old fishing boats that had been left outside them. The wood they were made from looked very old, and the paint had mostly been weathered off. But what was more concerning was that in this abandoned ghost town of a settlement, I wasn't alone. A van had pulled up with 3 or 4 young men getting out. I wasn't sure what they were doing exactly, but they were burning things into a trash can. What it was they were burning, I didn't know, but as I made my way out of the abandoned settlement, every time I looked back at the men by the van, at least one of them were watching me. Already feeling scared of the creepy surroundings, I now felt very unsafe because of these men staring suspiciously at me. I was paranoid that they were going to try to follow me, as if I had caught them doing something illegal. Thankfully, they stayed where they were, as I continued to make my way out of the ghost town and back along the trail. The abandoned settlement, the creepy men burning things by their van. That wasn't even the creepiest thing I came across on that hike. The creepiest thing I found actually came as soon as I decided to head back home, before I was even back at the Heritage Center. But that's a whole other story.